Representatives from Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the European Union gathered this week for high-stakes diplomatic talks in Geneva in the latest bid to defuse heightening tensions between Russia and Ukraine. While a plan has emerged to calm the situation, there is a long road before the two can reach common ground. Joining us now to help discern what's next on the horizon. In Fredericton, New Brunswick, Mikhail Molchanov. He is a professor of political science at St. Thomas University. In Waterloo, Ontario, John Jaworski, political science professor at the University of Waterloo. And with us here in studio, Helena Yakovlev-Golani, research scholar at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And we are happy to welcome our guests, Mikhail, you back to the program, and John and Helena for the first time on our program. Let's just bring up a map, if we could, control room, and remind everybody the part of the world that we're talking about, and take a look as well at the administration buildings that have been seized by pro-Russian militia. They are in the three capitals of Ukraine's eastern provinces. You see them there, Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Luhansk. And we're going to flip up another graphic here which indicate the percentage of people in those regions who say Russian is their native language. And the numbers are all, as you can see, significant. And therefore, we are where we are. Let's get into this. John Jaworski, could you tell us to what extent do you feel that Ukrainians who live in the eastern part of the country feel disenfranchised by an interim government that they feel favors the West instead of Russia?
Yes, I think they do have some reasons to feel concerned. As many people have pointed out, the present cabinet of ministers from Ukraine has very few representatives from eastern Ukraine. There are a few, but they're not very numerous. So for that reason alone, as well as for some concerns about the status of the Russian language in that reason, there is at least some reasons, although I don't think they're very significant, for concern on the part of the residents of eastern Ukraine.
Mikhail Molchanov, your view on whether or not these folks have a right to feel disenfranchised?
I think so. There are some grudges there that some of them are long-standing, some of them are recent, and well, the Party of the Regions, which was the party, of course, of the former ousted President Yanukovych, was essentially destroyed by Maidan protesters and by the pressure that was applied to members of that party. And the base of that party is actually in eastern Ukraine. For now, there is no replacement, and many people feel that they were left out of political process that is going on right now in Kyiv.
Okay, Helena Yakovlev-Golani, what's your view on that?
I would say that the situation is very complicated, and at first glance you would say they're disenfranchised, but on the other hand you have a very heavy propaganda. People watch Russian television where they're constantly persuaded that the radical government in Kyiv is going to eliminate Russian language. And the same thing happens on the Ukrainian channels, where these people are called names and called separatists. So it's more and more alienating these public and these protesters.
I see I think the Russian Prime Minister the other day put on his Facebook page the fact that it's another day and once again our people are being beaten and tormented in eastern Ukraine.
Well, that's what people in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, when you have the numbers and they watch Russian TV, that's what they get. And from these opinions and these views, they can form their own opinions, and they try to comfort themselves with the fact that they have something to say and to protest. And through these protests, they try to compel the central government to take their grievances seriously and to maybe increase their representation.
Mikhail, let me follow up with you. Do you think there's just far too much propaganda going through the air right now and it's not helping either side?
Well, undoubtedly propaganda is a factor, and undoubtedly these tensions are high and they are reflected in Russian TV especially, but I would like to make a point that also the clashes in the streets are real, and the people hurt are very real. Only 2 days ago, pro-Russian protesters were killed in Mariupol by Ukrainian forces. So the danger of escalation still exists, and it has to be dealt with.
John Jaworski, we are seeing groups of heavily armed men with no insignia on their uniforms taking up arms and taking control of government buildings. I've heard a lot of theories about what that's actually all about. What do you think?
Well, again, I think that although clearly there are locals who are unhappy with the situation in eastern Ukraine, who have some grievances vis-a-vis Kiev and the center, I think it's clear that much of the organization or inspiration for the protests does come from Russia. And I think many people have commented on this, and I think it's increasingly clear, and I think will become increasingly clear, that there's been a great deal of Russian interference in these affairs. I just wanted, however, I think it's important just for a little bit of historical perspective on the grievances in the region, that the grievances are partly related to the fact that this was a very privileged region during the Soviet period because of its coal mines, because of its steel industry. And it's now a rusting steel belt with massive ecological and social problems. And I think much of the unhappiness is over this loss of status, that this was a relatively prosperous and privileged region in the Soviet Union, and the decline, and we've seen the same kind of decline in other rust belts in the world, has been very precipitous. And maybe one other quick comment on the Party of Regions. It was mentioned that the protesters destroyed it. I would argue that the Party of Regions largely destroyed itself by becoming linked very heavily to a very corrupt Yanukovych regime and the Yanukovych family.
Let's get, if I can, Helena, back to this issue of the little green men that they're calling them, these people with no insignias on their uniforms. President Putin of Russia insists he has nothing to do with this. The West says he's orchestrating all of it. What's the truth?
Well, I don't think we can actually say that he is orchestrating everything, but you do. If you believe Putin, you shouldn't talk and you shouldn't have this conversation. But of course, we see implicit involvement of Russia, which is directed at fostering internal turmoil in Ukraine, and maybe even to disrupt presidential elections, or at least declare them as illegitimate in this kind of current situation. But you do have locals that support it. I don't believe that they support Russia or Yanukovych. They actually dislike them altogether. But what they want is just to have their voice to be heard in this situation.
Mikhail, how would you characterize the state of the Ukrainian military at this point?
Well, Ukrainian military is definitely no match for the Russian military at this point. It's been reorganized. The National Guard was just recently created. And of course, there are some ethnic issues which exist and cannot but exist inside the military. For example, just recently, as you know, several armored vehicles were captured by pro-Russian protesters in eastern Ukraine. And the reason they were able to do that was because apparently Ukrainian officers of East Ukrainian origin refused to shoot at protesters and refused to engage in military confrontation with civilians, and therefore apparently just abandoned their vehicles. So this is a factor which, apart from what Russia is doing or not doing, exists and has to be dealt with by the new government in Kyiv.
John, I think it's indisputable that the Ukrainian military does not match up, as Mikhail just said, with the Russian military. So having said that, they really can't play chicken with the Russian soldiers that are now in that region, can they?
No, they have to be extremely cautious. Now, I wouldn't over-dramatize the situation. I think there are many soldiers who, despite the poor funding they've received over the years, the poor equipment, would be highly motivated to act if necessary and if they have clear commands. I think much of the problem, in addition to the problems mentioned by Mikhail, has been a lack of good, effective command on the part of the new military officials at the top of the chain of command.
Let's talk, Helena, about what's in Russia's interest here. There's been a considerable amount of debate as to whether or not a destabilized Ukraine is in Russia's best interests. What do you think?
Well, I don't think about destabilizing Ukraine is the best interest of Russia, but that's how they perceive it right now.
That's who perceives it?
The Russians, because as long as there will be some kind of turmoil, they have their veto of decisions on the part of Ukraine, and they do not recognize the government in Ukraine as legitimate, so they always have this card to play with destabilizing even further Ukraine. But we should remember that even though you have these statistics of Russian speakers, right, and people who speak Russian, the majority of Eastern Ukrainians, they do not want to join Russia. And I would also add about your previous question, you shouldn't even talk about command or in the military. You should look at the defense budget of Russia and Ukraine when you have 70 billion above 70 billion budget in Russia, and you have just under 2 billion budget dollars in Ukraine.
This is American dollars you're comparing.
American dollars,
70
yes.
to 2.
To 2, right. So you can draw your own conclusion, and especially as our guest said that we have a problem of ethnicity, and some soldiers, they don't know against whom they fight because they're of Russian ethnicity, and some of them decline to participate in this.
Mikhail, Putin says Ukraine is on the verge of civil war. How satisfied do you think Ukrainians are with their interim government in terms of being able to handle the current situation?
Well, it's hard to say. Clearly, there is a split in the society, and some forces support the new government and some forces do not. But I would like to mention that it was former President Kravchuk who was the first to say Ukraine was on the brink of a civil war during the protests last month. So I don't think that it is in Russian interest to destabilize Ukraine intentionally. And even in a sense of Russian military presence in eastern Ukraine, if it is there, it is very limited. As you know, Russians deny it. Moscow denies this. And the government in Kiev could only produce 10 so-called intelligence agents who they question now, which is clearly not tantamount to a significant military force destabilizing the situation. So the eastern Ukraine needs some sort of dialogue, and they're not getting this dialogue from Kiev as yet. And the hope is on all sides, I believe, that they start talking and they start negotiating whatever arrangement should be appropriate for eastern Ukraine. I hope it will be federal arrangements.
John, let me read this excerpt from Foreign Affairs magazine from just the other day, and then I'll get you to react to it. It goes like this. Yet inattention to Ukraine's internal demons reflects a dangerous misreading of current events. The struggle between Russia and the West has been a catalyst, but not a cause. The protagonists in this conflict are subnational regions. The European Union association process, and especially the protests, repression, and revolution that followed, activated very deep and long-standing divisions between them. Unless Kiev deals with its regions and installs a more legitimate, decentralized government, Ukraine will not be won by the East or the West. It will be torn apart. That's Keith Darden in Foreign Affairs. To what extent do you think Ukraine's problems are internal, of its own making, as opposed to external?
Well, clearly the problems are very much internal, although the role of the external catalyst, I would argue, is very significant. And hearing President Putin talk about civil war in Ukraine reminds me of a phrase I came across, that Putin is like an arsonist pretending to be a fire inspector. It's clearly, I think, very cynical for him to talk about the prospects for civil war in Ukraine. But concerning the need for decentralization, for new institutional arrangements in Ukraine, I very much agree. But I think the new authorities are, in fact, reacting. And I don't think they've been passive in this sense, as Mikhail implied. So, for example, one of the first appointments in the new cabinet of ministers was they have a vice premier, a deputy prime minister for regional policy, Volodymyr Groysman from Vinnytsia, a very young, very energetic official who's been doing a great deal to promote local self-government, new forms and new sort of arrangements for local self-government in Ukraine. And he's been doing this quietly. He hasn't been publicizing himself very much. But I think the authorities in Kiev are very much aware of the need for decentralization and local self-government, although, you know, the term federalism here may not be very appropriate. And I'll mention an interesting reason why. If you take a look at what were the three large federal states in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, they were Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia.
All broken up today.
All broken up today. And in a sense, I sometimes use the phrase that federalism is now like an F word in many parts of Eastern Europe, since it's associated with the collapse of states. Now, we in Canada may not agree with that. In Canada, we see federalism as something very positive that we've used to manage our own internal differences. But the cynical way in which the term federalism has been used in Ukraine's federalism discourse has in fact discredited the term so thoroughly that I think we can only effectively use the term decentralization instead of federalism.
Okay, let me jump in here, and because you took issue with something Mikhail had said earlier, I feel I should give him an opportunity to respond. So Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, my opinion on federalism in Ukraine is probably more optimistic than John's. And of course, among the examples you given, we should also mention the Federal Republic of Germany, which is a quite successful case of federalization. So something along these lines would probably be suitable for Ukraine. And I'm optimistic as to the possibility that this can be achieved. And I'm also optimistic that these parts, when they receive new powers, new self-rule autonomy, they would not be pulled apart by Russia. By the way, I agree with John when he says, and with Elena, when they say that Eastern Ukraine is not willing to join Russia in the way Crimea was. They would like to remain in Ukraine, but enjoy local rights and the home rule.
Okay, Helena, let me pick up the story now with next month. There's going to be a presidential election May 25th. Given that the Ukrainian government at the moment doesn't control some parts of its own country, how legitimate can that election really be?
Well, if we talk about Russia, so let's say if the game of Russia is to get destabilized Ukraine, we will pretty much won't see any push for referendum. Mm-hmm. But if you believe that there is an annexation option exists, as with Crimea, so they probably push for some kind of referendum to destabilize even further the situation and to disrupt the presidential elections. But in any event, they won't recognize or they won't accept the outcome of these elections because they would say these are illegitimate elections.
The Russians will say that.
Yes, because they only recognize Yanukovych still, at least officially, as Ukraine's only and legitimate president.
Is he still in Russia?
Well, there is some rumors that he's in Donetsk, but we can't really.
No one knows for sure.
Right.
He's not holding press conferences anymore.
Not in Rostov.
He had that one press conference in Russia, right?
Two. And he was breaking pans and.
Many weeks ago. Well, tell me, while you've got the floor here, there have been some limited sanctions put on Russia so far. How much bite do you think they have had?
Well, in a short run, I don't think they will have any influence on Russia because Russia with Crimea, the Russians crossed the Rubicon. And it will be very hard, completely impossible, unfortunately, to force them out of Crimea. So, but in the long run, I would say 3 or 5 years, you will see that these sanctions will really work and they will influence or impact somehow economic situation in Russia. But if you want cause troubles to Russia, you will have to pay for these sanctions. And I'm not sure that the Europeans are ready to do it, are prepared to do it, because that would involve the diversification of their energy supplies. And with the dependency, when we have 30% dependency on Russia, it's very difficult to do it immediately.
They don't want to pay double the cost for their power.
But also, they don't have it, immediately to do it. It's not an option.
Mikhail, let me ask you the same question. What effect do you think the sanctions, limited though they may be so far, have had on Russia?
Well, I think there was some effect, clearly, maybe not as significant as was hoped for by the West. Nonetheless, the individuals who were targeted by these sanctions are all close to President Putin, all his close circle, and I think their interests were pinched a little bit, and they expressed their unhappiness in some forums to Putin. However, I would agree with Galina that unless something drastic is made with regards to the gas and oil relations between Russia and Europe, then the sanctions will not bring Russia to fold, so to speak. On the other hand, we do have some positive developments, right? Yesterday's talks in Geneva brought some results and compromises, and therefore there is a hope that these sanctions will not have to be escalated further.
Do you have much hope for the agreement that was negotiated yesterday actually having some long-lasting effect?
Well, it depends on its implementation. Clearly, if it's implemented on the ground, if pro-Russian protesters are successfully disarmed and they leave the buildings they occupy, and other militias are also disarmed, leave the buildings, then there is hope that the elections will be organized and will be conducted peacefully. I don't believe that Russia necessarily wants to disrupt these elections in May. And once the elections are over, Ukraine will have fully legitimate government, constitutional government, not revolutionary government it has at the moment. And this government would be dealing with the situation in Donetsk and Kharkiv and other Ukrainian regions where decentralization or increased autonomy is needed.
John, I'm literally down to my last minute here. Can you tell me whether you think the Russians aim to destabilize the election that will take place for the presidency next month?
I think Russia is still interested in destabilizing those elections, although who knows, attitudes can change. I think it's important to note, though, that after the Geneva meeting yesterday, John Kerry came out with a statement saying that if those agreements are not implemented, that the possibility of stronger and more vigorous sanctions is very much on the plate.
So this story continues in a major way, obviously, right?
Yes. Very much so.
Yes, indeed. I want to thank all of our guests for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. John Jaworski, on the line from Waterloo, Ontario. He's the professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. Mikhail Michalnov, remote from Fredericton, New Brunswick. He's a professor of political science at St. Thomas University. Mikhail, good to have you on the program for a second time.
My pleasure.
And Helena Yakovlev-Golani, research scholar at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And for John and Helena, their first time on our program, and we were delighted to have you both on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.